4 eras of the French Empire. The story of the French Empire unfolds across 4 great eras that rise and fall like tides against the shores of history, beginning with its origins in the fragmented lands of medieval Europe, growing into a powerful kingdom shaped by ambition and identity, expanding outward into a vast colonial network that stretched across continents, reaching a dazzling peak of cultural and military influence, and finally descending through war, resistance, and transformation into the modern nation that carries echoes of its imperial past. In the beginning, what would become France emerged from the ruins of the Western Roman world, where tribal kingdoms and feudal loyalties slowly gave way to centralized authority under early kings who forged unity from diversity, building the foundation of a state that would endure for centuries. Over time, this kingdom expanded through conquest, marriage, and diplomacy, consolidating lands and strengthening its institutions while shaping a distinct culture rooted in language, religion, and law. As centuries passed, France entered an era of outward expansion, driven by exploration, trade, and competition with rival powers, establishing colonies in distant lands where new societies formed under French rule, bringing both prosperity and conflict as cultures met and clashed. At its height, the empire stood as one of the most powerful forces in the world, its armies victorious on European battlefields, its cities flourishing with art and innovation, and its influence reaching across oceans to shape global history. Yet this peak was not to last, as internal struggles, revolutions, and global wars weakened the empire, leading to the loss of colonies and the redefinition of France's place in the world. Today, the legacy of the French Empire remains visible in language, culture, and institutions across many nations, a reminder of a complex past filled with ambition, brilliance, hardship, and change, offering lessons about power, identity, and the enduring impact of history. End of chapter. The birth of a kingdom from the ashes of Rome. Long before the idea of an empire took shape, the land that would become France was a patchwork of forests, rivers, and small settlements shaped by the fading memory of Roman order, where roads still stretched across the countryside and crumbling cities whispered of a lost age of unity and law. Into this world came the Franks, a confederation of Germanic tribes whose warriors moved with determination across the region known as Gaul, bringing with them new customs, new leadership, and a different vision of power. Among these early leaders rose Clovis I, a figure whose ambition and strategic mind would mark the true beginning of a unified realm, as he defeated rival tribes and extended his influence through both warfare and alliances, forging a kingdom that would stand as the seat of France itself. His conversion to Christianity was a turning point not only for his rule, but for the identity of the kingdom, aligning his people with the powerful church and gaining the support of the Gallo-Roman population who had long followed the Christian faith, creating a bond that would shape French history for centuries. As generations passed, the kingdom expanded and contracted under the weight of succession struggles and external threats, yet it endured through the strength of its institutions and the gradual development of feudal society, where land was exchanged for loyalty and knights pledged service to their lords in a system that brought both order and instability. In this era, castles rose across the landscape, built of stone and timber, standing atop hills or beside rivers, serving as both homes and fortresses where nobles governed their lands and defended their people. Life for the common folk was tied closely to the land, as farmers tilled fields of wheat and barley, raised livestock, and lived in small villages where the rhythms of life followed the seasons, marked by planting, harvest, and the observance of religious festivals. The rise of the Carolingian dynasty brought a new chapter of expansion and influence, most famously under Charlemagne, whose reign transformed the Frankish kingdom into a vast empire that stretched across much of Western Europe. His armies marched across mountains and rivers, conquering territories and bringing them under his rule. While his administration sought to impose order through laws, education, and the support of monasteries that became centers of learning and culture. Cities began to grow once more, connected by trade routes that carried goods such as cloth, wine, and metalwork, while scholars preserved knowledge and copied texts, ensuring that the legacy of earlier civilizations was not lost. Yet even this great empire could not remain united, as after Charlemagne's death it was divided among his heirs, leading to fragmentation and the gradual emergence of separate kingdoms, including the early form of France known as West Francia. Over time, the kings of this land worked to reassert their authority over powerful nobles, building a more centralized state that would eventually evolve into the Kingdom of France. Throughout this era, the seeds of empire were quietly being planted as the rulers of France learned to balance power, culture, and identity, preparing for a future in which their ambitions would extend far beyond their borders. Beyond the borders of this early kingdom, other civilizations were also rising and changing as the Byzantine Empire maintained its influence in the East, preserving Roman traditions while adapting to new challenges, and the Islamic world flourished with advances in science, trade, and architecture, connecting distant regions through networks of commerce and knowledge. These interactions, whether through conflict or exchange, would shape the development of France and its people, exposing them to new ideas and technologies that would influence their growth. Thus, the birth of France was not a single moment, but a long and complex process shaped by leaders, warriors, farmers, and thinkers, all contributing to the gradual emergence of a kingdom that would one day become an empire. The land was alive with movement and change, its people bound by loyalty, faith, and ambition, and its future waiting to be written in the centuries to come. End of chapter. The growth of power and the making of a nation. As the early kingdom of France emerged from the shadow of fragmentation, its rulers began the long and determined effort to consolidate authority over a land still divided by powerful nobles, ancient rivalries, and regional identities. Among these rulers, Hugh Capet marked the beginning of a dynasty that would patiently and strategically strengthen the crown, not through sudden conquest alone, but through careful alliances, marriages, and the steady expansion of royal influence. From his modest domain centered around Paris, the Capetian kings gradually extended their reach, building a system of governance that tied distant lands more closely to the throne. Paris itself began to transform during this era, growing from a fortified settlement into a thriving center of trade, learning, and administration. Narrow streets bustled with merchants selling cloth, spices, and crafted goods, while the Seine River carried boats loaded with grain, timber, and wine. Stone buildings replaced wooden ones, and great churches rose toward the sky, their bells marking the passage of time and the importance of faith in daily life. Among these, the construction of Notre Dame Cathedral stood as a symbol of both devotion and architectural achievement, drawing craftsmen and laborers whose skills reflected the growing sophistication of the kingdom. The expansion of royal power was not without conflict, as the kings of France faced formidable rivals both within and beyond their borders. One of the greatest challenges came from the kings of England, who held vast territories in France through inheritance and marriage. This tension would erupt into the long and devastating 100 Years' War, a struggle that spanned generations and reshaped the identity of the French people. Villages were burned, fields left untended, and entire regions plunged into hardship as armies marched across the countryside. Yet within this period of suffering emerged figures of remarkable courage and influence, none more iconic than Joan of Arc, a young woman who claimed divine guidance and inspired French forces at a critical moment in the war. Her presence galvanized the troops and helped turn the tide in favor of France, leading to key victories that restored confidence and unity. Though her life ended tragically, her legacy endured as a symbol of resilience and national identity, embodying the spirit of a people determined to reclaim their land. As the war drew to a close, the French monarchy emerged stronger and more centralized than before, having reduced the power of rival nobles and established a more cohesive state. The development of a standing army and improved systems of taxation allowed the crown to maintain control and respond more effectively to threats. Roads improved, trade expanded, and cities flourished, creating a sense of shared identity among people who had once seen themselves primarily as subjects of local lords rather than a unified nation. Daily life during this era was shaped by both hardship and gradual progress. Farmers worked long hours in the fields, bound by obligations but also benefiting from periods of stability that allowed communities to grow. Markets became lively centers of exchange, where goods from distant regions could be found alongside local produce. Artisans developed new techniques, producing textiles, metalwork, and tools that supported both everyday life and the ambitions of the kingdom. Meanwhile, beyond France, other powers were also evolving. In England, the monarchy sought to recover from its losses while strengthening its own institutions. In the East, the Ottoman Empire expanded rapidly, reshaping trade routes and political dynamics. Across Europe, the seeds of the Renaissance were beginning to take root, bringing renewed interest in art, science, and the human experience. These broader changes would soon influence France, pushing it toward a new era of exploration and expansion beyond its traditional borders. Thus, the growth of France during this period was not merely a matter of territory, but of identity, resilience, and transformation. The kingdom had endured war, internal strife, and external threats, yet it emerged more unified and more capable, ready to look outward and imagine a future that extended far beyond the lands of Europe. End of chapter. The dawn of exploration and the first steps beyond Europe. As France entered a new age shaped by curiosity and ambition, the world itself seemed to grow larger with each passing year, as sailors, scholars, and rulers looked beyond familiar horizons toward distant lands filled with mystery and promise. Inspired by the broader movement known as Age of Exploration, France joined other European powers in seeking new trade routes, resources, and influence across oceans that had once seemed impassable. The winds of change carried ships westward across the Atlantic and southward along the coasts of Africa, opening pathways that would transform not only France, but the entire world. One of the earliest and most significant figures in this expansion was Jacques Cartier, who sailed under the French crown in the 16th century and ventured into the vast waterways of North America. His journeys along the St. Lawrence River revealed lands rich in natural resources and inhabited by indigenous peoples whose lives were deeply connected to the forests and rivers. These early encounters were marked by both cooperation and misunderstanding, as cultures with very different traditions met for the first time. Cartier's voyages laid the foundation for what would become New France, a colonial presence that stretched across parts of modern-day Canada. As exploration gave way to settlement, French colonies began to take shape in the Americas. In these distant lands, small communities of settlers built homes of wood and stone, adapting to harsh winters and unfamiliar environments. They traded with indigenous nations, exchanging furs and goods, and established networks that connected the wilderness to European markets. The fur trade became a driving force of the colonial economy, with trappers and traders venturing deep into forests and along rivers, forming alliances that were crucial for survival and success. Leadership in these colonies often fell to governors appointed by the crown, men tasked with maintaining order, fostering growth, and defending the territory against rival powers. Among them was Samuel de Champlain, whose vision and determination helped establish the settlement of Quebec City. This settlement became a vital center of administration and trade. its wooden fortifications overlooking the river as ships arrived carrying supplies, settlers, and news from across the ocean. Life in Quebec was both challenging and vibrant as families worked the land, children learned trades, and communities formed around shared faith and purpose. The French presence was not limited to North America. In the Caribbean, colonies were established on islands where the climate allowed for the cultivation of sugar and other valuable crops. These plantations became central to the colonial economy, though they were built upon systems of forced labor that brought immense suffering to enslaved people transported from Africa. The wealth generated from these colonies flowed back to France, funding further expansion and contributing to the growth of cities and industries at home. Back in France, cities like Paris continued to flourish, becoming centers of art, philosophy, and political thought. Markets overflowed with goods from across the empire, including spices, sugar, and textiles, reflecting the growing interconnectedness of the world. The monarchy strengthened its control, supported by a bureaucracy that managed the increasing complexity of both domestic and colonial affairs. Yet this era of expansion also brought conflict, as France competed with other European powers such as Spain and England for control of territories and trade routes. Skirmishes and wars broke out across continents, from the forests of North America to the waters of the Atlantic, shaping the boundaries of empire through both negotiation and force. The people who lived through these times experienced both opportunity and hardship, as new possibilities emerged alongside new dangers. In distant parts of the world, other civilizations continued to thrive and adapt. The Ming dynasty in China maintained a vast and sophisticated state, while in India, powerful empires oversaw rich cultures and economies. In the Americas, indigenous nations navigated the challenges posed by European arrival, resisting, adapting, and surviving in ways that would leave lasting impacts on history. Thus, the dawn of exploration marked the true beginning of France's transformation from a European kingdom into a global empire. Ships carried not only goods and people, but ideas, beliefs, and ambitions that would reshape societies on multiple continents. It was an age of discovery and contradiction, where courage and curiosity coexisted with conflict and exploitation, setting the stage for the dramatic rise of the French Empire in the centuries that followed. End of chapter. The expansion of colonies and the struggle for dominance. As France's ambition stretched further across the globe, its colonial network began to grow into a vast and complex system that connected continents through trade, governance, and conflict. The lands of New France expanded deep into the interior of North America, following the great river systems that carved through forests and plains. French explorers and traders traveled along the Mississippi River, establishing outposts that would eventually link Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, forming a continuous arc of influence. Among these settlements, the city of New Orleans emerged as a vital port where cultures blended and goods flowed between the Americas and Europe. Life in these colonies was shaped by both cooperation and tension. French settlers relied heavily on alliances with indigenous nations, learning survival skills, trade practices, and navigation of the vast landscapes. These relationships were often mutually beneficial, yet they were also fragile, influenced by shifting loyalties and the pressures of European rivalries. The fur trade remained central, with voyageurs paddling canoes across long distances, carrying pelts that would be transformed into valuable goods in European markets. At the same time, France's Caribbean colonies grew increasingly important, particularly in islands such as Saint-Domingue, which became one of the richest colonies in the world due to its production of sugar and coffee. Plantations stretched across fertile lands, worked by enslaved people under harsh conditions. The wealth generated from these colonies contributed significantly to France's economy, fueling the construction of grand buildings, the patronage of the arts, and the expansion of military power. However, this expansion brought France into direct conflict with other European empires, especially Britain. The rivalry between these powers intensified over control of territories and trade routes, leading to a series of wars that would determine the fate of their colonies. One of the most decisive conflicts was the 7 Years' War, often described as a world war before its time, as battles were fought across Europe, North America, and beyond. In North America, this conflict took the form of the French and Indian War, where French forces and their indigenous allies clashed with British troops and colonial militias. Forts became key points in this struggle, standing as symbols of control over territory and trade routes. Among these, the confrontation near Fort Duquesne marked a significant moment, as control of the region shifted and the balance of power began to tilt in favor of Britain. The scale of these battles was immense, with thousands of soldiers marching through forests and across rivers, enduring harsh conditions and fierce combat. Muskets fired through the smoke of battle, cannons roared, and the outcome of each engagement carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. The bravery of soldiers, the strategies of commanders, and the resilience of those who lived in contested regions all played a role in shaping the course of the war. Ultimately, France faced defeat in the 7 Years' War, leading to the loss of many of its North American territories. This marked a turning point in the history of the French Empire, as it forced a re-evaluation of colonial strategy and shifted focus toward other regions, particularly the Caribbean and parts of Africa and Asia. Despite these losses, France remained a significant global power, its influence sustained by its culture, economy, and remaining colonies. Back in France, society continued to evolve, with growing tensions between different social classes. While the wealth from colonies enriched some, many people faced hardship, leading to increasing dissatisfaction that would eventually erupt into revolution. Cities grew more crowded, markets more vibrant, and ideas more daring, as philosophers and thinkers began to question traditional structures of power and authority. Elsewhere in the world, other empires were also experiencing change. Britain emerged stronger from the war, expanding its own colonial reach. In India, European powers competed for influence alongside local rulers, while in Africa, trade networks continued to connect diverse regions. These global dynamics created a world in which competition and cooperation were constantly intertwined. Thus, the expansion of the French Empire was both a story of ambition and struggle, marked by achievements and setbacks that shaped its destiny. The empire had reached across oceans and built connections that spanned continents, yet it had also encountered limits to its power, revealing the challenges of maintaining such a vast and diverse domain. The stage was now set for a new era, one defined not only by expansion, but by profound transformation within France itself. End of chapter. Revolution and the rebirth of power. As the 18th century drew toward its end, the foundations of the French kingdom began to tremble under the weight of inequality, financial strain, and rising expectations among its people. The wealth drawn from colonies and trade had not been shared evenly, and while nobles and elites enjoyed privilege and influence, many ordinary citizens struggled with high taxes, food shortages, and limited opportunities. In the bustling streets of Paris, voices grew louder, carrying ideas of liberty, equality, and reform that challenged the authority of the monarchy. These tensions would erupt into one of the most transformative moments in history, the French Revolution. The revolution began with demands for representation and fairness, but quickly escalated into a sweeping movement that reshaped every aspect of French society. Crowds gathered, symbols of royal power were attacked, and the old order began to crumble. The storming of the Bastille became a powerful image of defiance, as ordinary people took action against what they saw as oppression. The monarchy itself was brought to an end, and Louis XVI, once seen as the embodiment of royal authority, was executed, marking a dramatic break with centuries of tradition. In the years that followed, France experienced both hope and chaos. Revolutionary leaders sought to build a new society based on principles of citizenship and rights. Yet internal divisions and external threats led to periods of violence and instability. Armies from neighboring monarchies advanced toward France, determined to suppress the height of power and the limits of empire. In the years following his greatest victories, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the center of a vast and formidable empire that stretched across much of Europe, commanding armies that moved with discipline and precision, and reshaping the political landscape of the continent with each campaign. His influence reached from the Iberian Peninsula to the edges of Eastern Europe, and rulers across the continent were either his allies, his relatives, or his rivals. The dream of a unified Europe under French dominance seemed closer than ever before, and for a time it appeared that nothing could stand in his way. Paris became the heart of this empire, a city alive with energy, ambition, and transformation. Grand avenues were planned, monuments rose in celebration of victories, and institutions were strengthened to support the growing demands of governance. The legal reforms introduced through the Napoleonic Code brought a sense of order and consistency, influencing not only France but many of the territories under its control. Citizens experienced both pride in their nation's achievements and the burden of constant war, as conscription brought men from villages and towns into the ranks of the army. Across the empire, life varied greatly depending on location. In some regions, French rule brought modernization, improved infrastructure, and new opportunities for trade. Roads connected cities, markets expanded, and ideas flowed more freely than before. In others, however, occupation was met with resistance as local populations resented foreign control and the demands placed upon them. In Spain, guerrilla warfare emerged as a powerful force against French troops, with small bands of fighters using knowledge of the terrain to challenge a much larger army. The scale of Napoleon's military campaigns was immense. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched across plains, mountains, and rivers, carrying supplies, weapons, and the hopes of their nation. Battles were fought with muskets, artillery, and cavalry charges that thundered across the battlefield. One of the most defining moments of this era came with the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon faced a coalition of forces determined to end his rule once and for all. The clash was fierce and decisive, with shifting lines, desperate charges, and the roar of cannon fire echoing across the field. The defeat at Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon's reign and the collapse of his empire. He was forced to abdicate and was eventually exiled, bringing an end to a period of extraordinary expansion and ambition. The nations of Europe moved quickly to restore balance, redrawing borders and re-establishing monarchies in an effort to prevent the rise of another figure like Napoleon. Yet the impact of his rule could not be undone so easily. The ideas and reforms that had spread during his reign continued to influence societies, shaping legal systems, governance, and national identities. Even in defeat, the legacy of this era remained powerful, a reminder of both the potential and the dangers of concentrated power. Beyond Europe, the effects of these events were also felt. Colonies shifted hands, trade patterns changed, and the global balance of power evolved. In places like the Caribbean and parts of Africa, French influence persisted, though often challenged by other imperial powers. The world had become more interconnected, and the actions of one nation could ripple across continents. As France moved beyond the Napoleonic era, it faced the challenge of redefining itself once more. The dream of empire had reached its peak and collapsed, leaving behind a nation that had experienced both glory and loss. The lessons of this period would shape the decisions of future leaders, influencing how France approached power, expansion, and its role in the world. Thus, the height of the French Empire under Napoleon stands as a dramatic chapter in history, filled with triumph and tragedy. brilliance, and overreach. It was a time when ambition reached its limits, and the consequences of that ambition reshaped not only a nation, but the entire course of global history. End of chapter. The Second Empire and the return to global ambition. After the sigh of Napoleon's First Empire, France entered a period of uncertainty, shifting between different forms of government as it searched for stability and identity in a rapidly changing world. Monarchies were restored and challenged, republics were declared and tested, and the memory of past glory remained strong in the minds of both leaders and citizens. Out of this complex political landscape emerged a new figure who would revive the idea of empire, Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, who sought to restore France's prestige and expand its influence once more. Under Napoleon III, France embarked on a renewed period of imperial expansion, this time focused not only on Europe but on territories across Africa, Asia, and beyond. This era marked the formation of what is often called the Second French Colonial Empire, a vast network of colonies that would grow to become one of the largest empires in the world. Unlike the earlier empire of Napoleon Bonaparte, which had been centered on European domination, this new empire looked outward, driven by economic interests, strategic concerns, and a belief in spreading French culture and influence. One of the most significant expansions took place in North Africa, particularly in Algeria, where French control had begun earlier but was strengthened and expanded during this period. French settlers arrived in large numbers, building cities, farms, and infrastructure, while local populations experienced profound changes to their way of life. Resistance movements emerged, led by figures such as Abd al-Qadir, who organized efforts to defend their land and culture against foreign domination. The séjour in Algeria was long and difficult, marked by both fierce quarrel and determined expansion by French forces. In Southeast Asia, France established control over regions that would become known as French Indochina, including territories in present-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. These lands were rich in resources and strategically important, and French administrators worked to build infrastructure such as roads, railways, and ports to support trade and governance. Cities grew under colonial influence, blending local traditions with European architecture, while new systems of education and administration were introduced. Life in these colonies was complex and often unequal. French officials governed from administrative centers, supported by local intermediaries who helped maintain order and collect taxes. Markets bustled with activity, as goods such as rice, rubber, and spices were produced and exported to global markets. At the same time, many local people faced pire and secure, including forced labor and limited political rights, leading to tensions that would grow over time. Back in France, the Second Empire was a period of modernization and transformation. Paris underwent dramatic changes under the direction of Georges-Eugène Haussmann, whose redesign of the city created wide boulevards, parks, and modern infrastructure that improved living conditions and showcased the power of the state. Trains connected distant regions, industries expanded, and the economy grew, fueled in part by the resources and markets provided by the colonies. However, this era of expansion and prosperity was not without its challenges. France faced competition from other European powers, particularly Britain and Germany, as they too sought to build and expand their empires. Conflicts and rivalries intensified, both in Europe and overseas, creating a complex web of alliances and tensions. The rule of Napoleon III eventually came to an end following defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, a conflict that reshaped the balance of power in Europe and led to the Second Empire. Yet even as this political structure collapsed, the colonial empire it had expanded continued to exist, setting the stage for the next phase of French imperial history. Thus, The Second Empire represented a return to ambition on a global scale, a time when France once again reached outward to shape distant lands and cultures. It was an era of coup d'etat and contradiction, where progress and exploitation coexisted, and where the foundations were laid for both the Xinjia of empire and the struggles that would eventually bring it to an end. End of chapter. The age of colonial power and the lives within the empire. As the 19th century moved forward into the early 20th century, the French colonial empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching across vast regions of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. This was the era when France stood as one of the dominant global powers, its influence carried by ships that crossed oceans and by administrators who governed distant lands in the name of the Republic. The empire was no longer a scattered collection of territories, but a structured system, organized into regions such as French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa, each overseen by officials who reported back to Paris. In Africa, French control expanded across territories that included modern-day Senegal, Mali, Niger, and beyond. Railways were built to connect inland regions to coastal ports, allowing resources such as peanuts, cotton, and minerals to be transported for export. Colonial cities grew as centers of administration and trade, where European-style buildings stood alongside local markets filled with vibrant goods and traditions. Life in these regions was shaped by a blend of local customs and imposed systems, creating societies that were both resilient and deeply affected by colonial rule. In North Africa, particularly in Algeria and Tunisia, French influence was deeply entrenched. Cities featured grand boulevards, government buildings, and cultural institutions that reflected French styles, while local populations maintained their languages, religions, and traditions. The tension between these worlds was ever present, as policies often favored settlers and colonial authorities over indigenous communities, leading to social divisions and resistance movements. In Asia, French Indochina continued to develop as a key part of the empire. Rice paddies stretched across fertile plains, worked by farmers whose labor sustained both local populations and export markets. Rivers served as vital transportation routes, with boats carrying goods and people between villages and cities. French administrators introduced new systems of education and law, aiming to create a class of local elites who would support colonial governance. Yet beneath this structure, movements for independence began to grow as people sought greater control over their own futures. Daily life within the empire varied widely depending on location and social status. In colonial cities, cafes and markets brought together people from different backgrounds, creating spaces where cultures mixed and interacted. Street vendors sold food rich with local flavors, while imported goods from Europe added new tastes and textures to daily life. Transportation ranged from horse-drawn carriages and riverboats to the expanding network of railways that connected regions and facilitated trade. The military presence of France was a constant feature across its empire. Soldiers were stationed in forts and barracks, maintaining order and defending territories. Many of these soldiers were themselves recruited from the colonies, serving in units that would later play significant roles in global conflicts. The experience of these exploits reflected the complex relationships within the empire, where loyalty, chakwa, and inequality were deeply intertwined. Globally, this period was marked by intense competition among imperial powers, often referred to as the scramble for Africa and broader colonial rivalry. Nations sought to claim territories, secure resources, and expand their influence, leading to diplomatic tensions and occasional conflicts. France navigated this environment through both negotiation and fights, securing its place as a major colonial power. However, beneath the surface of this vast empire, challenges were growing. Resistance movements became more organized, and the costs of maintaining such a large and diverse system began to strain resources. Ideas of self-determination and nationalism spread, influenced by global events and changing perspectives on governance and rights. At the same time, Europe itself was heading toward a period of Falkland conflict that would reshape the world. Alliances formed, tensions escalated, and the interconnected nature of global empires meant that any major war would have far-reaching consequences. The French Empire, at the height of its power, stood on the edge of a new and uncertain era. Thus, this age of colonial dominance was both a peak and a turning point, a time when the empire appeared strong and expansive, yet was already facing the forces that would eventually lead to its transformation. The lives of millions across continents were shaped by its presence, creating a legacy that would endure long after the empire itself began to fade. End of chapter. World War and the beginning of the end. As the 20th century unfolded, the strength of the French Empire was tested in ways that few had anticipated. As global conflict erupted on an unprecedented scale during the World War I, this war drew in nations from across the world, and the vast reach of the French Empire meant that its colonies became deeply involved in the Xingyen. Soldiers from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean were recruited and sent to fight on European battlefields, where they faced conditions far removed from their homelands. The Tuileries trenches of northern France became symbols of the brutal nature of this conflict, where soldiers lived in mud and array, enduring constant artillery fire and the threat of sudden attacks. Among the most devastating battles was the Battle of Verdun, a sickos that lasted for months and resulted in immense loss of life. The scale of destruction was unlike anything seen before, and the Cisgen left deep scars on the land and the people. Colonial troops played a crucial role in these battles, fighting with courage and determination despite often facing discrimination and unequal treatment. Their contributions were vital to France's ability to withstand the pressure of the war, and their experiences would later influence movements for greater rights and independence in their home countries. When the war finally ended, France emerged on the winning side, but the cost had been staggering. Cities and villages lay in ruins, economies were strained, and an entire generation had been affected by the horrors of war. The empire remained intact, but the sense of invincibility had been shaken, and new challenges began to emerge. Between the wars, France sought to rebuild and maintain its global position, but tensions continued to rise across Europe and beyond. Economic difficulties, political instability, and the growth of new ideologies created an imbibe of uncertainty. In the colonies, demands for reform and self-governance grew stronger as people who had contributed to the war effort questioned their place within the empire. These tensions would soon be overshadowed by an even greater conflict, the World War II. This war brought rapid and dramatic changes, as France itself was invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany. The tableau of France in 1940 shocked the world and marked a turning point in its history. The empire became divided, with some territories remaining loyal to the Vichy government while others joined the Free French forces led by Charles de Gaulle. Across the empire took on many forms. In North Africa, campaigns were fought across deserts, while in Southeast Asia, Japanese forces challenged European firesing. Colonies once again became strategic assets, their resources and bears high, contributing to the broader war effort. The experiences of these years further weakened the bonds of empire, as the contradictions between ideals of freedom and the reality of colonial rule became more apparent. When World War II came to an end, the world had changed dramatically. New powers had emerged, old empires were weakened, and the soja of colonial fascia was increasingly questioned. Movements for independence gained momentum, driven by leaders and all who sought to shape their own destinies. Thus, the World Wars marked a turning point for the French Empire. They revealed both its strength and its vulnerabilities. highlighting the wide ranges of its diverse peoples while also exposing the inequalities at its core. The empire that had once seemed unshakable now faced a future filled with uncertainty as the forces of change gathered strength across the globe. End of chapter. The collapse of empire and the wars of decolonization. In the aftermath of the Second World War, France stood at a crossroads, both victorious and deeply weakened, with its global empire strained by years of conflict and its authority increasingly challenged by movements demanding independence. The ideals of liberty and equality, long associated with France itself, were now being echoed across its colonies, where people questioned why those principles did not apply to them. Across Africa and Asia, political organizations, resistance movements, and nationalist leaders began to rise with growing determination. One of the most intense struggles unfolded in French Indochina, where long, simmering tensions erupted into the First Indochina War. In this conflict, French forces attempted to maintain control over territories that included modern-day Vietnam, but they faced a determined independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. The war was fought across dense jungles, remote mountains, and river deltas, where traditional warfare was transformed by guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and prolonged sieges. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where French forces were surrounded in a remote valley and subjected to sustained assault. The conditions were harsh, with supply lines cut and morale steadily weakening under constant pressure. When the battle ended in defeat for France, it marked the end of its colonial presence in Indochina and signaled a major shift in the global balance of colonial power. Meanwhile, in North Africa, another and even more politically charged conflict was beginning to unfold in Algeria. Unlike other colonies, Algeria was considered not just a territory, but an integral part of France, with large populations of European settlers living alongside indigenous communities. Tensions had been building for decades, and in 1954, they erupted into the Algerian War, a brutal and complex conflict marked by guerrilla warfare, urban resistance, and severe political division within France itself. The war in Algeria was not fought only on battlefields, but also in cities, villages, and homes, where questions of identity, belonging, and justice were deeply contested. French military operations aimed to suppress the independence movement, while groups within Algeria fought for self-determination. The conflict created deep fractures within French society, leading to political instability and widespread debate about the future of the nation and its empire. It was during this period of crisis that Charles de Gaulle returned to power, tasked with stabilizing the country and resolving the Algerian question. Under his leadership, France underwent a major political transformation with the establishment of the Fifth Republic, a system designed to provide stronger executive authority and greater stability. This marked a turning point in French governance as the state restructured itself to face both internal and external challenges. Eventually, after years of conflict and negotiation, Algeria gained independence in 1962, marking one of the most significant losses in the history of the French Empire. This event symbolized the broader collapse of colonial rule across Africa and Asia, as wave after wave of independence movements succeeded in ending European imperial control. France, once a vast global empire, was now transitioning into a post-colonial nation. In the years that followed, many former colonies in West and Central Africa also gained independence, often through negotiated transitions rather than prolonged wars. While political control ended, economic, linguistic, and cultural ties remained, creating a complex legacy that continues to shape relationships between France and these nations today. Thus, the collapse of the French colonial empire was not a single moment, but a long and difficult process marked by war, negotiation, and transformation. It was an era of profound change, where the meaning of empire itself was questioned and ultimately redefined. France emerged from this period no longer as a colonial superpower, but as a modern state, adjusting to a world shaped by independence, globalization, and new forms of influence. End of chapter. The Modern Republic and the Legacy of Empire. After the end of its colonial empire, France entered a new historical phase defined not by territorial expansion, but by reconstruction, identity, and adaptation to a rapidly globalizing world. The nation that had once ruled vast overseas domains now focused on rebuilding its role within Europe and redefining its influence through diplomacy, economics, and culture rather than direct control. The memory of empire, however, remained deeply embedded in its institutions, language, and society. In the decades following decolonization, France strengthened its political system under the Fifth Republic, maintaining stability while navigating internal debates about immigration, national identity, and historical memory. The presence of people from former colonies reshaped French cities, particularly Paris, Marseille, and Lyon, creating diverse urban landscapes where languages, cuisines, and traditions from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean became part of everyday life. This transformation reflected the long historical connection between France and its former empire, now expressed through migration rather than governance. Economically and politically, France became a leading member of the European community, participating in the development of what would become the European Union. Instead of projecting power through colonies, France now worked through alliances and shared institutions, promoting cooperation across borders. Its global influence continued through language, education, science, and culture, with French remaining one of the most widely spoken languages in the world due to its colonial past. Yet the legacy of empire continued to shape global relationships. Former colonies such as Senegal, Algeria, and Vietnam maintained complex ties with France, involving trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and sometimes political tension. The shared history of colonization and resistance created bonds that were neither purely positive nor purely negative, but deeply intertwined with identity and memory. Within France itself, historians, artists, and writers began to re-examine the imperial past with greater nuance, exploring both its achievements and its injustices. Museums, literature, and public debates reflected an ongoing effort to understand what the empire had meant for France and for the world. Monuments and urban spaces built during the imperial era remained visible reminders of this history, standing alongside modern developments that reflected a different vision of national identity. The lessons drawn from this long imperial journey are complex. The French Empire demonstrated the power of centralized governance, military organization, and cultural influence, but it also revealed the consequences of inequality, resistance, and overextension. It showed how empires can shape the world in lasting ways through language, infrastructure, and shared history, while also leaving behind difficult questions about justice, memory, and responsibility. In the modern era, France continues to balance these legacies, participating actively in global affairs while reflecting on its past. Its story is no longer one of expansion across continents, but of adaptation within a connected world where influence is measured not only by territory but by ideas, culture, and cooperation. Thus, the long history of the French Empire comes to rest not in a final ending, but in transformation. From early tribal kingdoms to global colonial power, from revolutionary upheaval to modern republic, its journey spans centuries of ambition, conflict, creativity, and change. The empire itself no longer exists in form, but its echoes remain across continents, in languages spoken, cities built, borders drawn, and histories remembered. The final lesson it leaves is that power is always temporary, but the consequences of power endure far beyond the age in which it was wielded. End of chapter. Epilogue of memory, language, culture, and the living empire within history. Even after the formal end of imperial rule, the influence of France continued to live on in ways that were not bound by borders or armies, but by language, culture, education, and shared historical memory. The French language itself became one of the most enduring legacies of the empire, carried across continents and spoken today in Europe, Africa, North America, and the Caribbean, forming a vast linguistic community often referred to as the Francophonie, represented in part by Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, which connects nations through culture, education, and cooperation. In cities across the world, the architectural imprint of the French Empire remains visible. In places like Hanoi, Algiers, Dakar, and Montreal, buildings shaped by French urban planning still stand, their facades reflecting a blend of local adaptation and European design. Wide boulevards, public squares, administrative buildings, and cathedrals or civic halls all tell silent stories of a time when French governance shaped the physical structure of distant lands. These spaces have since been repurposed, reclaimed, and reinterpreted by local populations, becoming part of new national identities while still carrying traces of their colonial origins. French cuisine also spread widely through colonial and cultural exchange, merging with local traditions to create unique hybrid food cultures. In West Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean, dishes evolved that combined French techniques with regional ingredients, producing new culinary identities that continue to thrive today. Markets in former colonies often reflect this blend, where bread, spices, tropical fruits, and local staples coexist in vibrant daily life. Education systems in many former colonies still carry structural influences from French models, including language instruction, administrative systems, and legal frameworks. This has created both continuity and debate, as nations balance inherited systems with efforts to develop approaches rooted in local culture and post-colonial identity. The result is a complex intellectual landscape where French influence is neither fully embraced nor fully rejected, but continuously reinterpreted. The memory of empire is also preserved in museums, literature, and public discourse within France itself. Institutions in Paris and other cities collect artifacts, documents, and artworks from colonial periods, presenting them in ways that attempt to capture both the achievements and the controversies of imperial history. Writers and philosophers continue to explore themes of identity, power, and responsibility, asking how a nation shaped by empire should understand its past while building its future. Scientific and technological contributions made during the imperial era also remain part of this legacy. Expeditions that mapped territories, documented cultures, and studied natural environments contributed to global knowledge, even as they were often conducted within unequal power structures. These records are now studied both for their scientific value and for what they reveal about the mindset of the imperial age. In modern France, debates about immigration, national identity, and historical memory continue to reflect the long shadow of empire. Families with roots in former colonies are now part of the fabric of French society, contributing to politics, art, sport, and business. This ongoing integration demonstrates how the empire, though politically dissolved, continues to exist socially and culturally in new forms. Across the former colonial world, nations that once formed part of the French Empire have developed their own identities, governments, and cultural expressions, yet historical ties remain present in trade agreements, diplomatic relations, and shared institutions. These relationships are often complex, shaped by both cooperation and the memory of past inequalities. Thus, the story of the French Empire does not end with a single moment of collapse or conclusion, but continues as a living legacy distributed across the modern world. It exists in language spoken by millions, in cities shaped by history, in cultures that blend multiple origins, and in ongoing conversations about justice, identity, and memory. The empire as a political structure has ended, but as a historical force, it continues to evolve within the lives of people who inherit both its benefits and its burdens. End of chapter. Final reflection on power transformation and the arc of empire. When the long history of the French Empire is viewed as a single unfolding story, it becomes less a straight line of conquest and more a vast and shifting cycle of rise, adaptation, and transformation, where each era contains within it the seeds of the next. From the early unification of the Frankish tribes under leaders like Clovis I to the centralized monarchy of later centuries, from revolutionary upheaval to imperial expansion under figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte, and from colonial dominance to modern republic, each stage reflects a different expression of power shaped by its own time. At its core, the French imperial story is also a story of geography and imagination. The rivers of Europe, the ports of the Atlantic, the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of Southeast Asia, and the islands of the Caribbean all became interconnected through networks of trade, war, migration, and administration. These landscapes were not merely backdrops to history, but active participants in it, shaping how armies moved, how cities grew, and how cultures interacted and transformed. The empire's rise was driven by a combination of military strength, technological advancement, political organization, and cultural ambition. Its armies marched across Europe under leaders like Napoleon, its ships crossed oceans during the Age of Exploration, and its administrators built systems that governed distant lands. Yet each expansion brought new complexity. As diversity increased, resistance grew, and the challenges of governing vast territories multiplied. The peak of imperial power revealed both its brilliance and its limits. France was able to project influence across continents, but maintaining such a vast structure required constant effort, resources, and control. Conflicts like the 7 Years' War and later global wars demonstrated how interconnected and fragile imperial systems had become, as rival powers contested the same spaces and ideas of global dominance. The decline of empire was not sudden but gradual, shaped by wars, revolutions, and the rise of nationalist movements. Figures such as Charles de Gaulle played key roles in managing this transition, guiding France from imperial collapse toward a redefined national identity within a post-colonial world. The end of formal empire did not erase its influence but redistributed it across cultural, linguistic, and diplomatic networks. One of the most important lessons of this long history is the relationship between power and consequence. Empires are built through ambition and organization, but they are sustained only as long as they can adapt to changing political, economic, and moral realities. When those realities shift, even the most powerful structures must transform or dissolve. Another lesson lies in the human dimension of empire. Behind every battle, treaty, and administrative decision were millions of lives shaped by these events. Soldiers who fought in distant lands, families who migrated across oceans, communities that adapted to new rulers, and societies that preserved their identity under pressure all contributed to the fabric of this history. The empire was never a single entity acting alone, but a vast network of human experience. In the modern world, the legacy of the French Empire continues to influence global culture, politics, and identity. It appears in languages spoken across continents, in legal and educational systems, in architectural styles, and in the shared histories of nations that were once connected through imperial rule. It also appears in ongoing debates about memory, justice, and responsibility as societies continue to interpret what this history means for the present and the future. Ultimately, the arc of the French Empire is a reflection of a broader human story about the rise and fall of great powers, the interaction of cultures, and the constant evolution of political and social systems. It reminds us that history is never static. That influence extends beyond borders and generations, and that every empire leaves behind more than territory. It leaves a transformed world. And so the story ends, not with closure, but with continuation, as the echoes of empire persist in the modern age, not as domination, but as memory, connection, and enduring influence across the global human landscape. End of chapter. The French Empire in comparison, and the world it helped shape. When placed alongside other great empires of history, the French imperial experience reveals both unique characteristics and shared patterns that define the rise and fall of large civilizations. Like the Roman Empire before it, France developed systems of law, administration, and infrastructure that extended far beyond its original heartlands. Like the British Empire, it expanded across oceans, building networks of trade, settlement, and cultural exchange that connected distant continents into a single global system. Yet the French experience also carried its own distinct rhythm, shaped by repeated cycles of revolution, restoration, and reinvention. Few empires in history transformed their own political identity so many times while still maintaining continuity as a state. From monarchy to republic, from empire to republic again, and through modern democratic structures, France demonstrates how a nation can survive imperial collapse by reshaping the meaning of authority itself. One of the most defining aspects of French imperial history is its relationship with ideas. The French Revolution did not merely change France internally. It exported ideological currents across the world, influencing movements for independence, constitutional governance, and human rights. Even during the Napoleonic era under Napoleon Bonaparte, military conquest carried with it legal and administrative reforms that reshaped European governance long after his defeat. In contrast to purely extractive empires, the French model often combined material control with cultural integration. Language became one of its most enduring tools of influence, spreading through education systems, administration, and migration. This linguistic legacy remains visible today in regions across Africa, North America, and Southeast Asia, where French continues to function as a language of government, diplomacy, and education. The colonies themselves were not uniform spaces, but diverse environments shaped by geography, resistance, and adaptation. In West Africa, territories such as Senegal became centers of trade and administration, while also nurturing intellectual and political movements that would later contribute to independence struggles. In Southeast Asia, regions like Vietnam became sites of cultural blending and eventual resistance that fundamentally altered the course of colonial history. The economic dimension of empire also played a central role. Colonial systems provided raw materials, agricultural goods, and strategic resources that fueled industrial growth in France, while also binding colonies into global trade networks dominated by European powers. This interdependence created prosperity for some, but inequality for many. And it is within this tension that much of the modern critique of empire is rooted. Military power remained a constant through every phase of French imperial expansion, from early European conflicts to global wars. Events such as the World War I and World War II revealed both the global reach of French involvement and the limits of imperial endurance. The participation of colonial soldiers in these wars further highlighted the interconnected nature of empire, where people from across continents were drawn into conflicts centered in Europe. As the empire dissolved, its structures did not simply disappear, but were transformed. Administrative systems influenced modern governance in former colonies. Infrastructure built during colonial rule became the foundation for new national economies, and cultural exchanges continued through migration and education. Even the process of decolonization itself created new political identities that continue to evolve today. In the contemporary world, the legacy of the French Empire exists not as a single unified system, but as a network of relationships, memories, and influences. It can be seen in international organizations, in diaspora communities, in shared cultural practices, and in ongoing political dialogue between France and former colonies. This legacy is neither entirely positive nor entirely negative, but deeply complex, shaped by centuries of interaction. Ultimately, the French Empire stands as a reminder that empires are not only structures of control, but also engines of connection. They create links between distant societies, but those links carry both creativity and conflict. They generate shared histories that cannot be easily separated once formed, and when they end, they leave behind not emptiness, but transformation. Thus, the French imperial story, when viewed in full, becomes a story about how power moves through time, how cultures intersect, and how nations reinvent themselves after great change. It is a story without a final ending, because its consequences continue to unfold in the present world, in language, in memory, and in the ongoing relationships between peoples once bound together under empire. End of chapter. The living aftermath and the continuing echo of empire in the modern world. Even after centuries of transformation, the influence of the French Empire continues to echo through the structures of the present day, not as a political force of control, but as a deep and layered historical current that still shapes how nations interact, how cultures evolve, and how people understand identity across continents. The empire has become history, yet history itself remains active, woven into everyday life in ways that are often visible and often subtle. In modern France, cities stand as living archives of imperial time. Paris, with its grand avenues, museums, and monuments, carries within its architecture the memory of both revolution and empire, monarchy and republic, conquest and reconstruction. The flow of people through these spaces reflects centuries of movement, including migration from former colonial territories that has reshaped the cultural fabric of the nation. Languages spoken in markets, schools, and homes now reflect a global history that extends far beyond Europe. Across the wider world, former colonial regions have developed into independent nations with their own political systems, identities, and aspirations. Yet many continue to maintain connections with France through trade, diplomacy, education, and shared institutions. Countries such as Algeria, Senegal, and Vietnam exemplify this complex relationship, where history is neither erased nor fully repeated, but continuously reinterpreted through modern realities. The French language remains one of the most powerful legacies of the empire, serving as a bridge across continents. It is used in international diplomacy, academic research, and cultural exchange, linking societies that once shared colonial ties, but now engage as sovereign partners. This linguistic continuity reflects how empire, once built on hierarchy and control, has evolved into networks of communication and cooperation. Cultural influence also persists in literature, cinema, philosophy, and art. Writers and thinkers from both France and its former colonies continue to explore the meaning of identity in a post-imperial world, examining questions of memory, belonging, and historical responsibility. These creative expressions reveal how the past is not static, but constantly reinterpreted by each generation. Economically, the relationships forged during the imperial era have transformed into global systems of trade and investment. While the structures of control no longer exist, patterns of exchange still reflect historical connections. Infrastructure built during colonial times, from ports to railways, continues to serve as the foundation for modern economies, even as new technologies and industries reshape global development. The military dimension of empire has also evolved. Former colonial soldiers and their descendants have become part of national armed forces in independent states, while France itself participates in international alliances and peacekeeping operations rather than territorial expansion. The nature of power has shifted from occupation to cooperation, though the memory of earlier conflicts remains present in diplomatic relations. At the human level, the most enduring legacy of the French Empire is the blending of histories. Families across continents carry mixed cultural inheritances shaped by migration, education, and historical movement. Food, music, language, and traditions reflect centuries of exchange, sometimes voluntary and sometimes forced, but always contributing to the diversity of the modern world. Yet alongside this interconnectedness remains an ongoing process of reflection. Museums, academic studies, and public debates continue to examine the moral and historical dimensions of empire, seeking to understand its consequences without simplification. This process is not about reaching a final judgment, but about maintaining awareness of how deeply the past is embedded in the present. In this sense, the French Empire can be understood not as something that ended, but as something that transformed. Its political structure dissolved, but its cultural, linguistic, and historical influence dispersed across the globe, becoming part of a shared human story that transcends national boundaries. And so the journey that began with early tribal kingdoms grew through centuries of monarchy and revolution, expanded across oceans through exploration and colonization, reached its peak in global power, and ultimately transformed into a modern republic, continues still in another form, not as empire in the old sense, but as memory, influence, and connection across a world that remains shaped by its long and complex history. End of chapter. End of chapter. Final continuation and the endless flow of history. When a history stretches across so many centuries, from the earliest foundations of a kingdom to the far-reaching consequences of global empire, it becomes clear that no ending is ever truly final. The French Empire, though dissolved as a political structure, continues to exist in the movements of people, the exchange of ideas, and the layered identities of nations that were once part of its reach. What remains is not an empire of borders, but an empire of echoes. The modern world that surrounds France today is itself shaped by the long interactions of imperial history, international cooperation, global trade, migration patterns, and cultural exchange all carry traces of earlier centuries when ships crossed oceans under royal flags and administrators governed distant lands. Even in a time of sovereign nations, the networks formed during that period continue to influence how the world functions. Within France, the legacy of empire is present in everyday life in ways that are often so familiar they are overlooked. Cuisine reflects ingredients and influences gathered from across former colonies. Music and art draw upon traditions that span continents. Urban neighborhoods reflect waves of migration that have transformed society into something far more diverse than it once was. These changes are not separate from history, but are direct continuations of it. In the former colonial world, the transformation has been equally profound. Nations that once existed under imperial rule now define their own paths, building institutions, economies, and cultural identities shaped by both indigenous traditions and historical interaction with France. The relationship is no longer one of ruler and subject, but of independent states connected by shared history and ongoing engagement. The deeper lesson that emerges from the full arc of this story is that empires are not simply systems of domination that rise and fall in isolation. They are processes that reshape both the governing and the governed, leaving behind patterns that endure long after formal authority disappears. The French Empire is one of the clearest examples of this, because its influence did not end with independence movements or political restructuring, but continued in more subtle and enduring forms. Figures from every stage of this history, from early monarchs like Clovis I to revolutionary leaders, emperors, and post-colonial statesmen such as Charles de Gaulle, represent different interpretations of power, identity, and national purpose. Each era redefined what France was and what it could become, showing that national identity is never fixed but always evolving. The global events that shaped the empire's rise and fall, including conflicts such as the World War I and the World War II, demonstrate how interconnected the modern world became through the very systems that empires helped create. What began as expansion ultimately became interdependence. In reflecting on this long and complex journey, it becomes clear that the story of the French Empire is also a story about transformation itself. It is about how societies expand, collide, adapt, and redefine themselves over time. It is about how power creates connection, and how connection creates consequence. And it is about how history, once set in motion, continues to evolve in ways that no single generation can fully control. So the final truth of this narrative is not closure, but continuation. The empire no longer exists as a governing force, yet its influence persists in the structures of the present world. It lives in language, culture, memory, and global relationships. It lives in the ongoing dialogue between past and present, and it lives in the understanding that history is never truly finished, only carried forward. The eternal return of memory and the unfinished story of France. If one were to step back far enough from the timeline of nations and empires, the history of France begins to resemble a river that never stops flowing, changing its course, widening in some places, narrowing in others, yet always moving forward. Even after the formal end of empire, the currents of its past continue to shape the present in ways that are both visible and invisible, conscious and unconscious, political and cultural. In the modern era, France exists as a republic firmly embedded in global systems of cooperation, trade, and diplomacy. Yet it carries within it layers of history that stretch back to the earliest tribal kingdoms, through the medieval consolidation of power, through revolution, empire, and decolonization. Each layer remains present beneath the surface, influencing how the nation understands itself and how it is perceived by others. The memory of the French Empire is not contained in a single place or moment. It is scattered across continents. It lives in the cities built during colonial rule, in the languages spoken across Africa and the Caribbean, in the legal systems adapted from French administration, and in the cultural exchanges that continue to evolve today. It also lives in the debates within France itself, where history is constantly re-examined, questioned, and reinterpreted by each new generation. In former colonial territories, the story continues in parallel. Nations such as Vietnam and Algeria have long since established their independence, yet the historical relationship with France remains part of their national narratives. It appears in education, in diplomatic relations, and in cultural memory, sometimes as connection, sometimes as tension, and often as both at once. The transformation of empire into memory is one of the most profound changes in modern history. Where once there were administrative structures governing vast territories, there are now networks of influence shaped by language, migration, economics, and shared history. The French language, carried across generations, continues to function as a living bridge between societies that were once bound by imperial rule, but now interact as equal participants in a global community. Figures from the long arc of French history remain symbolic, anchors in this ongoing narrative. Leaders such as Napoleon Bonaparte represent the height of imperial ambition and military expansion, while figures such as Charles de Gaulle represent the adaptation of France into a modern post-imperial state. Their legacies are not fixed conclusions, but ongoing points of reference in debates about power, identity, and national direction. The global conflicts that reshaped the 20th century, including the World War I and the World War II, serve as reminders that the French story cannot be separated from the wider story of the world. These events demonstrated how deeply interconnected nations had become and how the consequences of empire extended far beyond its formal borders. As time moves forward, the meaning of empire itself continues to change. It is no longer understood solely as territorial control, but also as influence, memory, and historical continuity. In this broader sense, the French Empire has not disappeared entirely, but has been absorbed into the structure of the modern world, where its effects are distributed rather than centralized. The final reflection that emerges is that history is never a closed book. It is a continuous process of reinterpretation, where the past is constantly re-examined through the lens of the present. The French Empire, with all its complexity, contradictions, achievements, and consequences, remains part of that ongoing process. And so the story continues, not as a tale that ends, but as a living narrative carried forward by time itself, shaped by those who remember it, study it, debate it, and live within its legacy. End of chapter. Beyond empire and into the global web of the present. When the long arc of French history is extended into the present moment, it becomes clear that what once existed as empire has dissolved into something far more diffuse, yet also more enduring. A web of relationships that connects continents without the need for formal control. The structures of empire have been replaced by systems of globalization, where influence travels through trade, communication, culture, and migration rather than through direct governance. France today operates within this global system as a modern republic, but its historical footprint gives it a unique position within the international order. Its language continues to function as a diplomatic medium across multiple regions. Its legal and administrative traditions remain influential in various political systems, and its cultural output continues to circulate widely across the world. These elements are not relics of the past, but active components of the present. The former territories of the empire, now fully independent nations, have developed their own identities and trajectories, yet the historical connections remain visible in many forms. In countries such as Senegal and Cambodia, the legacy of French rule can still be seen in education systems, administrative language, and urban infrastructure, even as these societies have transformed them into something distinctly their own. Migration has become one of the most important channels through which this shared history continues to evolve. People from former colonial regions have settled in France in significant numbers, bringing with them languages, traditions, cuisines, and cultural practices that have reshaped French society itself. This movement has created a form of reverse influence, where the former center of empire is now deeply shaped by the cultures of its former peripheries. In this context, identity becomes layered rather than singular. A person may be simultaneously connected to France, to a former colony, and to a global diaspora community. This complexity reflects the deeper transformation of the world since the Age of Empire, where fixed categories of center and periphery have given way to overlapping networks of belonging. The memory of empire continues to be actively debated within France. Historians, educators, and public institutions engage with questions about how to present colonial history, how to acknowledge its impacts, and how to understand its role in shaping modern society. These discussions are not merely academic, but deeply connected to contemporary politics and social life. At the same time, global institutions and international cooperation frameworks have taken on roles that once would have been associated with imperial systems of coordination. Organizations focused on diplomacy, trade, health, and cultural exchange now connect nations through mutual agreement rather than hierarchy, reflecting a fundamental shift in how global order is maintained. The transformation from empire to interconnected world did not erase the inequalities or conflicts of the past, but it did change the way they are expressed and addressed. Issues that were once managed through imperial authority are now negotiated through international dialogue, legal systems, and global civil society. The French experience illustrates this transformation in a particularly clear way because of the scale and duration of its imperial history. from early monarchy through revolutionary upheaval, from Napoleonic expansion through colonial global reach, and finally into post-colonial integration. France embodies the long evolution from territorial empire to modern nation within a global system. Yet even in this modern form, the echoes of earlier eras remain present. They appear in architecture, in language, in cultural memory, and in the shared histories of nations that were once connected through empire. These echoes do not determine the present, but they inform it, shaping how societies understand their past and imagine their future. And so the story does not conclude with disappearance, but with transformation into a different kind of existence. One where empire is no longer a structure of rule, but a pattern of influence woven into the global fabric of human history. End of chapter. The final layer of history and the understanding of continuity. At the deepest level of reflection, the story of the French Empire becomes less about geography or politics and more about the way human societies evolve over time, carrying forward memory, structure, and identity even as institutions rise and fall. What once was empire is now a set of enduring patterns, visible in culture, language, and global connection, but also in the way history itself is understood and taught. In France today, the past is not distant. It is present in education, where students study the long arc of national development from early kingdoms through revolutionary change, imperial expansion, and modern republican identity. It is present in public spaces, where monuments, museums, and preserved architecture stand as physical records of earlier eras. And it is present in public debate, where questions about history, responsibility, and memory continue to shape national conversation. Across the world, in nations that once formed part of the empire, the historical relationship continues to be examined through multiple perspectives. In Algeria, for example, the memory of colonial rule remains deeply woven into national identity and historical consciousness, while in Vietnam, the experience of resistance and independence has become a foundational part of modern state identity. These perspectives are not identical, but they are connected through a shared historical framework that continues to evolve. One of the most important realizations in studying this long history is that empires do not simply end, they transform into other forms of influence. Political control may disappear, but cultural patterns, economic relationships, and linguistic networks often persist for generations. This is especially true in the case of France, where the transition from empire to republic did not erase global connections, but reshaped them into new forms. The figure of Napoleon Bonaparte remains a central reference point in understanding the heights of imperial ambition, while Charles de Gaulle represents the adaptation of France into a post-imperial global actor. Between these poles lies the broader story of transformation, where power is repeatedly redefined in response to internal change and external pressure. The global conflicts of the 20th century, including the World War I and the World War II, accelerated the dissolution of traditional imperial systems and replaced them with new international structures. These wars demonstrated that global interconnection had reached a level where no empire could remain isolated or fully self-contained. In the present era, the legacy of the French Empire is often discussed not as a single narrative, but as multiple overlapping stories. For some, it represents cultural exchange, linguistic unity, and historical achievement. For others, it represents inequality, conflict, and contested memory. Both perspectives are part of the same historical reality, and both continue to shape how the past is understood. What emerges from this complexity is a deeper understanding of continuity. History is not a sequence of disconnected chapters, but a continuous process in which each era reshapes what came before and influences what comes after. The French Empire is one expression of this process, but not its conclusion. Even now, the effects of centuries of expansion, revolution, colonization, and transformation continue to unfold in ways that cannot be fully predicted. They appear in migration patterns, in global culture, in political alliances, and in the everyday lives of people who may not always be aware of the historical threads that connect them. And so, the final reflection is that there is no final ending to such a story. There is only continuation, reinterpretation, and movement forward through time. The French Empire, as history, remains alive not as a structure of power, but as a living network of memory and influence that continues to evolve within the modern world. End of chapter. The infinite horizon of interpretation and the closing of a non-ending story. When a narrative extends across millennia of human change, it eventually reaches a point where continuation no longer means adding new events alone, but rather deepening the understanding of what has already been told. The story of the French Empire, when carried into this reflective space, becomes less a chronicle of rulers and territories and more a meditation on how history itself is constructed, remembered, and experienced. In the present world, France exists not as an empire, but as a participant in a dense global network of nations, institutions, and cultural exchanges. Yet its past continues to shape how it interacts with the world around it. Diplomatic relationships, linguistic communities, educational systems, and cultural exports all carry traces of centuries of expansion and transformation. The empire has dissolved, but its imprint remains embedded in the architecture of modern global life. Across former colonial regions, history is not a closed chapter but an active presence in shaping identity. In Senegal, modern national identity reflects both indigenous traditions and historical interactions with France, forming a layered cultural landscape. In Cambodia, the experience of colonial rule and later independence continues to inform education, governance, and cultural memory. These histories are not identical, but they are connected through shared experience of global transformation. Within France itself, the legacy of empire exists in both tangible and intangible forms. Museums preserve artifacts, archives preserve documents, and cities preserve architecture from colonial and imperial periods. At the same time, living communities preserve memory through language, storytelling, and cultural practice. The past is therefore not separate from the present, but interwoven with it in everyday life. Figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte continue to symbolize the height of imperial ambition and the threshold, where history becomes reflection and reflection becomes history again. When a narrative continues beyond its natural political and chronological boundaries, it begins to shift from recounting events to examining the meaning of events themselves. The French Empire, when viewed through this lens, becomes less a sequence of conquests, colonies, revolutions, and collapses, and more a vast human experiment in organization, identity, and transformation across time. In the present era, France stands as a modern republic integrated into global systems of cooperation, where influence is measured through diplomacy, economics, science, culture, and shared institutions rather than territorial expansion. Yet the memory of its imperial past remains present in subtle and enduring ways. It appears in education systems, where history is taught not as a single narrative but as a contested and multi-layered field of interpretation. It appears in cultural life, where literature, cinema, and art continually revisit the imperial period to explore its complexities. In countries that were once part of the empire, such as Algeria and Vietnam, the legacy of French rule remains woven into modern national development. It is present in language use, administrative frameworks, and cultural exchange, but also in historical memory and political discourse. These nations have long since defined their sovereignty, yet the shared history with France continues to influence their relationships in the present. The long arc of imperial history also reveals how deeply interconnected global systems have always been. The movements of people, goods, ideas, and institutions did not begin in the modern era, but were accelerated and structured through imperial networks that spanned continents. The French Empire was one of the major contributors to this process, linking regions that might otherwise have remained more isolated from one another. Figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte remain central to understanding the intensity of imperial ambition and its capacity to reshape entire regions in relatively short periods of time. Meanwhile, Charles de Gaulle represents the later adaptation of France into a state that redefined its role within a post-imperial world order, focusing on sovereignty, cooperation, and global participation rather than expansion. The global conflicts of the 20th century, especially World War I and World War II, marked the decisive turning point in which imperial systems across the world began to unravel under the pressures of industrial warfare, ideological change, and emerging demands for self-determination. These events demonstrated that global power could no longer be maintained through traditional imperial structures alone. As the world moved into the post-imperial age, the French experience became part of a broader global transition. Empires were replaced by nations, colonies became independent states, and international organizations emerged to manage relationships between sovereign entities. Yet even as structures changed, the underlying historical connections remained intact, shaping patterns of cooperation and tension in the modern world. In this way, the story of the French Empire becomes a mirror for the broader story of human history itself. It shows how societies expand, adapt, and reorganize themselves over time, and how the consequences of those processes persist long after the original structures disappear. It demonstrates that history is not a closed system, but an evolving continuum shaped by memory, interpretation, and ongoing change. And so this chapter arrives at a point where continuation no longer means adding new events, but recognizing that every interpretation becomes part of the story. The French Empire exists now as both history and reflection, both past and present, both concluded and ongoing in the minds of those who study it, the point where narrative dissolves into understanding. When a story is extended beyond its natural historical arc, it eventually reaches a state where events no longer advance the narrative in a linear way, but instead circle back into interpretation, meaning, and perspective. The French Empire, when considered at this level, becomes less a subject of chronology and more a framework through which the evolution of modern global society can be understood. France today exists as a sovereign republic shaped by centuries of transformation, yet it remains deeply connected to the historical currents that once carried it across continents. Its institutions, its language, and its cultural reach continue to reflect the long process through which a regional kingdom expanded into a global imperial power and then transformed into a post-imperial state embedded within international systems. Across former colonial regions, the legacy of this shared history continues to evolve in distinct and diverse ways. In Senegal, the French language and administrative influence remain part of public life, even as national identity has developed its own strong cultural and political foundations. In Vietnam, historical memory of colonial rule and resistance continues to shape education, cultural identity, and national narrative, forming part of a broader story of independence and modernization. The enduring presence of these connections demonstrates that the end of empire does not equate to the end of influence. Instead, influence becomes redistributed, transformed, and reinterpreted through new political and cultural frameworks. What was once hierarchical becomes networked, what was once centralized becomes dispersed, and what was once enforced becomes negotiated. Historical figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte continue to represent the apex of imperial consolidation and military ambition. while Charles de Gaulle represents the later phase of national redefinition, where France repositioned itself within a changing world order after the decline of colonial structures. Their significance lies not only in their actions, but in how they are continually reinterpreted by successive generations. The global wars of the 20th century, including World War I and World War II, function as turning points that accelerated the transition from imperial systems to international frameworks based on sovereignty and cooperation. These conflicts revealed both the scale of global interdependence and the limits of imperial control in the modern industrial age. In the post-imperial world that followed, former empires did not vanish in influence but were reconfigured into new forms of global interaction. Cultural exchange, migration, economic interdependence, and shared institutions replaced direct colonial administration, creating a world that is more connected, but also more complex in its historical relationships. At this stage of reflection, the French Empire can be understood not as a single entity that existed and ended, but as a process that contributed to shaping the modern world. Its history becomes part of a larger continuum in which no civilization is fully isolated from those that preceded or followed it. And so, the narrative reaches a threshold where continuation no longer adds new territory to the story, but deepens awareness of its existing structure. The empire becomes memory, and memory becomes interpretation, and interpretation becomes part of the ongoing history of the present moment, the final echo of expansion and the return to human scale. When the long narrative of the French Empire is extended beyond political history into philosophical reflection, it eventually returns to the most fundamental unit of all historical change, the human experience itself. Empires rise and fall through decisions made by individuals, but their consequences are carried by millions whose lives are shaped by forces far larger than any single intention. France today exists as a modern republic, but its identity is still layered with the accumulated experiences of centuries. The transformations from early Frankish kingdoms under figures like Clovis I, through revolutionary upheaval under leaders such as Napoleon Bonaparte, and into the post-imperial era, guided by statesmen like Charles de Gaulle, form a continuous chain of adaptation rather than separate isolated periods. In former colonial regions such as Algeria and Senegal, history continues to be experienced not only as distant memory, but as part of lived cultural identity. Languages, administrative systems, and educational frameworks reflect historical interaction, while national narratives reinterpret those experiences in ways that emphasize independence, resilience, and self-determination. The global conflicts that reshaped the 20th century, especially World War I and World War II, stand as defining moments where the limits of imperial systems became unmistakably clear. These wars demonstrated that technological advancement, industrial capacity, and global interconnection had transformed the scale of human conflict beyond anything earlier empires had faced. After these turning points, the world transitioned into a structure defined less by empires and more by networks of sovereign states. Yet even within this new structure, the legacies of imperial history continued to shape borders, languages, trade routes, and cultural relationships. The French experience is particularly significant in this regard because of the breadth of its global reach and the depth of its cultural influence. In this final layer of reflection, the idea of empire itself becomes less a historical object and more a conceptual tool for understanding how power, culture, and identity interact across time. It becomes clear that empires do not simply occupy space, they reorganize it. They do not only govern populations, they reshape how populations relate to one another long after governance ends. The French Empire, in this sense, is no longer a closed chapter of history. It is a continuing presence within modern global systems, expressed through language communities, cultural exchange, migration, and shared historical memory. It exists not as authority but as influence, not as structure but as pattern. And so the narrative returns, finally, to the human scale from which it began. Individual lives, decisions, movements, and memories form the real substance of history. Empires are built upon them, sustained by them, and ultimately dissolved back into them. What remains is not dominance or collapse, but continuity of human experience across time. This is where the story rests, not in silence, but in understanding that every ending in history is also a beginning in perception. The French Empire concludes as a political reality, but continues endlessly as a historical presence carried forward by human memory and interpretation. The closing of the cycle and the return of the world to its many voices. At the farthest edge of this extended narrative, where history is no longer measured only in empires or states, but in the total movement of human civilization, the story of the French Empire blends into the wider story of the world itself. It becomes impossible to isolate it as a single thread, because every thread has already been woven into a larger fabric of global development. France today exists as one participant among many in a dense international system of nations, each shaped by its own histories, yet interconnected through centuries of exchange. The institutions of modern governance, diplomacy, and economics reflect lessons learned not only from French history, but from the shared experiences of all major historical powers that rose, expanded, and transformed over time. The long arc that began with early consolidation under rulers like Clovis I, expanded through revolutionary transformation under figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte, and adapted into modern republican governance under leaders like Charles de Gaulle, is now understood as part of a broader human pattern rather than a unique trajectory. It is one variation of a global phenomenon in which societies organize, expand, and eventually restructure themselves in response to internal and external change. In former colonial regions such as Vietnam, Algeria, and Senegal, the legacy of French influence persists not as a governing structure but as part of layered historical identity. These societies have developed independent political systems, cultural expressions, and national narratives, while still engaging with the historical imprint left by centuries of interaction. The global wars of the 20th century, particularly World War I and World War II, marked the decisive shift from imperial competition to global interdependence. These conflicts revealed that the scale of human interaction had become fully worldwide, making it impossible for any single empire to define the structure of global order. In the aftermath of that transformation, the world moved towards systems based on cooperation, sovereignty, and shared institutions. Yet the remnants of imperial history did not disappear. They were absorbed into these systems, influencing language distribution, economic relationships, and cultural exchange. The French experience remains one of the clearest examples of this transformation from empire to network. At this stage, the story no longer progresses forward in the traditional sense. Instead, it expands outward, becoming a reflection on how all historical narratives eventually dissolve into interconnected systems of meaning. The boundaries between French history, European history, and global history begin to fade, revealing a single continuous field of human development. The final understanding that emerges is that no empire is truly self-contained. Each one is shaped by what came before it, influences what follows it, and continues to exist in transformed ways long after its formal structure has ended. The French Empire, like all empires, is therefore both specific and universal, both historical and ongoing in its consequences. And so the cycle closes, not with an ending, but with a widening. The narrative returns to the world in its full complexity, where many voices exist side by side, each carrying fragments of shared history. The French Empire remains within that chorus, no longer as a dominant line, but as one of many echoes contributing to the ongoing story of humanity. The dissolution of the final frame and the return to silence within history. At the most distant point of reflection, where narrative stretches beyond empire, beyond nation, and even beyond chronology, what remains is not another event to describe, but the realization that all historical stories eventually converge into the same fundamental truth: that human civilization is a continuous unfolding rather than a sequence of isolated endings. The French Empire, when viewed from this final perspective, is no longer an object contained within textbooks or timelines. It becomes a field of influence that has already been absorbed into the wider structure of global history. Its former territories, once governed through direct authority, now exist as independent nations such as Algeria, Senegal, and Vietnam, each carrying its own trajectory while still reflecting the historical interactions that once connected them. Within France itself, the long accumulation of historical layers remains visible in architecture, language, cultural memory, and institutional structure. Yet even these layers are not static. They are continually reinterpreted by new generations who approach the past from different social, political, and intellectual perspectives. History, therefore, is not preserved in stillness, but in constant motion. The great figures who once defined the direction of empire, from early unifiers like Clovis I to revolutionary and imperial figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte, and later modern statesmen like Charles de Gaulle, now exist as reference points within a much larger interpretive landscape. They are no longer actors within a living system of power, but symbols through which that system is understood. The global conflicts that once accelerated the transformation of empire, especially World War I and World War II, now serve as structural turning points in the broader narrative of global modernity. They mark the shift from imperial competition to international interdependence, from territorial expansion to systemic cooperation and conflict management. At this final level of abstraction, even the idea of continuation begins to change meaning. Continuation is no longer the addition of new historical content, but the recognition that all content already exists within a single ongoing system of human development. The French Empire, in this sense, has not ended so much as it has been redistributed across time, space, and interpretation. And so the narrative arrives at its final transformation, where even the act of storytelling dissolves into awareness of continuity itself. There is no final chapter beyond this point, because every conclusion becomes a beginning when viewed from another angle, and every ending becomes a continuation when placed within the wider flow of history. What remains is not silence as absence, but silence as completion of form, where the story no longer needs to proceed because it has become fully integrated into understanding.